All right, let's get things started. You're listening to the Stories from the 78 podcast, which is part of the Stories from the 78 website. And I assume that you know that since you clicked on the whole thing. So either way, thank you for taking time to listen, to watch, and to explore all the things in and around Chicago and wherever I might travel on a given day. And speaking of traveling, my friend Laura, she writes for the Stories from the 78 site, and she posted a fantastic story of this spot out in Fenville, Michigan. It's called Cranes Pie Pantry Restaurant and Winery. Yeah, you got that all in there. A restaurant, a pie place, winery, all of it in one spot out in Fenville, Michigan. Being from Chicago, going to Michigan is probably like the equivalent of people in New York, maybe going like to the Hamptons or, or something like that, right? Like that's Chicago. You go up either to Michigan on the lake, or you find like a secluded lake out in Michigan, or you head up to Wisconsin and do the same type of thing. You just get out of the city of Chicago. Because after, a summer, it could just be a little much. You need to get out of the city and decompress, because with all the concrete jungle around you, you need a little spot to just kind of flex, right? So that's what Laura did. She went out there, wrote a great story. So I highly recommend checking it out. And watching the little piece that she did. It's fantastic. I got to give a shout out to, though, 25 years of 115 Bourbon Street. Now, Bourbon Street on Chicago's South Side in Marionette Park, which is this little suburb that is kind of surrounded by the city of Chicago. It's very bizarre, but there are a few suburbs in the city of Chicago, like that they just did an annex back in the day. And that's one of them right there, connected to Chicago in many ways, though. But either way, it's not far from like St. Rita High School, Marist High School, Mother Macaulay High School, St. Xavier University, among other things, right? And the reason why I say all those high schools and colleges is because everybody who is from that area of the city. So if you went to like Sandburg, Stagg High School, Mother Macaulay, the other ones, the aforementioned ones that I mentioned, you go away to school and you come back, and your first year back, when you go to college on Wednesday before Thanksgiving is called Black Friday. And if you don't know that, I'm sorry. And now you do. Everybody, at least my generation, grew up on that area going to Bourbon Street when you came home from school. It was just like a thing that you did. You didn't go downtown. You didn't go to Naperville or any of that crap. Nope, you went to Bourbon. And that's what people would say. They didn't call it 115 Bourbon Street. No. They're like, who's going to Bourbon? Let's go to Bourbon. And they have a gigantic parking lot. And to give you an idea of Bourbon Street, in full disclosure, I had my wedding reception there. And that's how much I love Bourbon Street. And it's the people that run it. Nick and Lori, who run Bourbon Street, and the people that have worked there over the years who run it in conjunction with Nick and Lori. And I'm talking about Kenny, who happens to be the bachelorette, right? But he still does work over at Bourbon. And you have Samantha, who I've done many years work, and Scott and Mandy, who worked there for years as well. They're just wonderful people. That place is just a special spot. It is, if you will, the WGN of bars in Chicago. It really is, because it's massive. It has a huge reach, and many people have gone through there, and it's like family. And that's kind of how I view them. That's how I look back and think about the time working there. I started, I grew up going there in terms of, like, when I say grow up, I'm talking like when I was 18 to like 25. Because you could go there for a funeral luncheon, first communion, or a wedding, and everything in between. Mud wrestling, MMA fighting, concerts. They have several of their own programs that are like American Idol, but a Bourbon Idol type of thing. It's just a special place. And they celebrated 25 years this past Sunday. I did a story with Patrick, who's the marketing manager over there, and we talked a lot about just what makes Bourbon Street so special. And I was really happy to be part of the history there, starting with WGN when I was a around town producer for Annabelle Ball. The first year, I believe my first year being the around town producer was 2014, somewhere around there. And I thought that up till then, in all due respect to what they did before, I thought the St. Patrick's Day was a little lackluster. And I was like, we could really do something special, like special. And I know just the spot to do it. And I cold called them. I was just like a random, or cold emailed, I should say, emailed them. I got an email back from Mandy or Scott, I think, or Sam, one of those three. And they were like, we would love to be part of this live broadcast for WGN. And that's what it turned into, a live broadcast starting at 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. We brought our entire morning show out there outside of like 2 that stayed back at the station. And at the time, you're talking, I mean, we just brought everybody out there. We had, Larry, Paul, Robin, Toomey, Jindra, Tomasulo, Jiggets, Ponce, and Morgan Kolkmeyer. Like we had everybody out there, and we just did it right, man. We broadcast for 4 hours out there, and it just was outstanding. It was so much fun, and it wouldn't be possible without Nick and Lori like making serious accommodations to a TV station with that many talent. And then you have the staff of WGN working with the staff of Bourbon, and Bourbon Street just got it. And it was just this magical thing that we were able to put on. And if you look up YouTube and you can look up YouTube and see some of the things that we did over at Bourbon on St. Patrick's Day. And I am proud to say that it's still, as of 2024, a tradition, even though I am not at WGN, but my counterpart over at WGN these days, Natalie Scrid, puts on this segment with Saviano and also Aline Cox. So they're keeping that tradition alive, and I'm very proud to say that I started that tradition. It almost got me fired a couple times, including we'll just call her Blank Sparks, who was a grinder girl. I can't say it on here, but Blank starts with a P, ends with a Y, Sparks. She did a little grinding on TV with some kids in the background. So if you want to look up and laugh on YouTube, try to find that one. That one's a doozy. But either way, Bourbon Street, that was St. Patrick's Day, and they gave people free breakfast. They are just wonderful people. And then I had my wedding there, and it was like that for my wedding. And everybody that worked at WGN that was at the wedding were shocked at how glamorous they made that back room, where we had I think we had inflatables, obstacle courses back there and stuff like that. That's where our wedding reception was, and it was fantastic and it was wonderful. And I can't say enough about Bourbon Street. In fact, I've spent 8 minutes doing it. So either way, I think that's wonderful, and you should check out the story on the Stories from the 78 page, and you'll hear our conversation with Nick. And I love the randomness of Chicago. It's one of my favorite things. And one of the randomness things is burlesque dancing at a hotel. And this is happening in the West Loop at the Emily Hotel. I'm reaching over here just to make sure I got it all here. So the Emily Hotel in the West Loop, they have the Jungle Dimension Burlesque show at Selva. And it's like a walking burlesque show. So I'm not familiar with walking burlesque up until this point. So, you think of burlesque shows, you think of them, you're sitting down or on a stage and they're doing their thing, shaking what God gave them, right? And the walking burlesque show is that, except they're walking around this space atop Silva, which is the restaurant atop the Emily Hotel. And it's awesome. It's amazing. And it's got this Latinesque and infused kind of burlesque. So you see, perhaps it's more of an inclusive array of folks that are doing the burlesque dancing. It's a lot. I mean, you can't go wrong with anybody doing burlesque though, right? I mean, it's a good time. And it's beautiful at the same time. Yeah, sure, is it sexy and exotic, but it's also beautiful dancing, and you get to see a lot of colors of the culture that the ladies are wearing as their costumes, any tattoos, the whole thing. It's all there for you to take a look at. So that is one of my favorite things about Chicago, that those things happen on a regular. And if you're looking for other things that happen on the regular that are like hidden spots, well, then I have the perfect story for you. It's called the 500. So of course, now this thing's not working. Here we go. The 500 Hidden Secrets of Chicago, about the hidden gems in the city, from author Lauren Vera. Her and I chatted about all the cool things about Chicago. So you want to dive into behind, and I'm not talking about things that you might see right up on TripAdvisor. These are things that people in the city vote as their number one things, like the Lula Cafe in Logan Square, hidden gem But right there on Logan Square, the food is outstanding. Every time you go, the food is great. And that's why it made her list. And among other things, different neighborhoods to travel to, because Chicago, the reason why this is called Stories from the 78 is there's 78 neighborhoods, 77 technically areas, community areas in Chicago. Like right now, I'm talking to you from, I think, South Edgebrook, technically. Or Jefferson Park, technically within that is South Edgebrook. You know, according to the old timers in the neighborhood, it's South Edgebrook. But and that gives you an example. Like within neighborhoods like Lakeview, there's East Lakeview, there's West Lakeview, there's what formerly is called Boys Town, which is not called Boys Town anymore. Now it's called something more a little bit aligned to today's standards. But for years it was called Boys Town because that is where the gay community for the men kind of started and called that area home in the Chicago north side. So there's lots of little neighborhoods, and that's where this kind of falls into place. You kind of find 5 hidden gems, different neighborhood spots for, you know, nature, for restaurants, for bars, for entertainment, so on and so forth. You have all of that with the 500 secrets, hidden treasures, if you will, of Chicago. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, just because it's a fun story, and you know, I talked to this gentleman. His name is Stephen Hoffen, and he has tracked global food insecurity with his groundbreaking solution of these hydroponic farms, if you will. Let's just call them that. They're like these pods, not farms, pods. And he started his own foundation and nonprofit called Growing Peace. And he's installed hydroponic systems in diverse settings, including food banks, community centers, facilities, low income and disabled areas, or I'm sorry, low income areas, and also areas for disabled seniors. He's done stuff in Israel. He's done stuff out in New York. You talk about urban farms and growing vertical farms, the whole thing. By the way, he hasn't finished high school. Yeah. That's where he's at. Growing Peace is his nonprofit. His name is Stephen Hoffen, and he's won a bunch of awards. He's raised $80,000 and used those funds to grow these systems and communities that need it worldwide. And he has helped over 33,000 people with the types of things that he's done. So it's a really fascinating story. He's a well-spoken kid. And I don't want you to sound like condescending when I say he's a good kid, because he's in high school, you know what I mean? And I'm 44. So he is a kid to me, but man, oh man, he's well beyond my years. The fact that he had the foresight to come up with something like this is pretty impressive. And he's a pretty impressive young man who has a passion, who is going to do great things in his lifetime, because he's, like I said, he hasn't been on the planet 20 years, and he's already started something that most people never even thought of, and really taking into account food insecurity. And I have a unique aspect of how I see Chicago, right? And I drive around the city all the time for work and really get to see different neighborhoods. And there's a lot of areas that just don't have any, you know, food. There's no restaurants, there's no Happy Foods or Whole Foods or any of that, grocery stores of any kind. They're just liquor stores, some like 7-Eleven type stores, mostly liquor stores that don't really carry any fresh foods. And that's what he's trying to do. And a lot of these hydroponic pods that he comes up with, they could be put anywhere. They can be put in urban settings like Detroit, Michigan, or in Tel Aviv, in Israel, and grow things that typically wouldn't grow, or you wouldn't think that they would grow there. So it's a great story. I highly suggest checking it out on the Stories from the 78 website. It's all right there. There's a nice picture of Steven kind of doing his thing with the farm, if you will. I also posted a couple things about just listening to this website because, you know, why not? And let me see here. Those are all the things I wanted to talk about this week. I think they were fantastic. The wife and I went to Michigan, and we drove through Detroit, and that will be a great 78. I'm going to sprinkle those stories in over the next few weeks. But Detroit's awesome. And if you haven't been, and I'm not one of those people from Chicago that thinks Chicago's the only city that's great. I mean, as much as it pains to say it, I really do love New York. I think New York's a good time, even though it could be overrated at times as far as how great it is. You know, just if you take into account how much of a pain in the ass it is to get around that place, but whatever. It is still great. It is great for culture and entertainment and everything else in between. Chicago is right up there with New York. Detroit is on the rise, though. It really is. It is. If you know anything about the history of Detroit, it is a city that used to be called the Paris of the Midwest. The way it was designed, the intention that it had to its downtown. Woodward Avenue was like Fifth Avenue in New York City or Michigan Avenue in Chicago. And it was completely decimated for years and years and years. I mean, horribly decimated. And now I walked from where the Detroit Tigers play all the way down to Woodward to the river. I don't know, it's a good stretch, mile or so. And when I first went to Detroit 15 odd years ago, it was not a place you would want to walk. It was terrifying, to be completely honest. And now you feel like you're walking down Michigan Avenue, or it's kind of a mix between Michigan Avenue, Fifth Avenue in New York City, and like a street in Paris. That's what it feels like walking in Detroit. It's beautiful. And the way that they brought back the buildings is beautiful. And I, as an American, am proud of the fact that that city is on its way back. And it gives me hope for other parts of Chicago that need the help. Because don't get me wrong, there are many parts of Detroit that are still desolate and completely abandoned and not there. But at least they're aware of the problem and they had to start somewhere. I mean, to give you scope, I believe Detroit's bigger than Oakland and Milwaukee if you put them together. It's just a massive footprint of a city. You know, a size similar to Chicago. New York's, it's tough to compare anything to New York just because they count every borough as part of the city, which is just stupid. You know, like New York City, if you talk to anybody from New York City is Manhattan. That's New York City. Maybe Brooklyn, you know what I mean? But counting like Long Island, you know, as part of New York, or Queens as like New York City, you know, whatever, to each their own. So, but it definitely had like Manhattan vibes down Woodward Avenue in Detroit. And also had, like I said, vibes of like walking down Michigan Avenue towards the older part of Michigan Avenue. Because the thing with, and this will be the final thing, I'm sorry I'm rambling here, but the thing about Detroit, and a friend of mine said this so eloquently, is that when Detroit fell, let's just say when it went bad, and it went bad really fast. I mean, the 60s and the riots made it go bad, but the city was still there. But it, like in the 80s, it just, in the 70s and 80s, it just, for a city the size of Detroit, which I think at the time, it was like the fourth largest city. It was right behind Chicago as far as how big cities. And it fell so fast. People just left in droves. They just left. Crime got out of control and people just left. Like they just left their houses, whether they sold them or not, and left. They didn't care. It was that bad. And what they've turned it into now with their downtown is incredible to see, because all those buildings that people left, they were just there and they kind of were, you know, looted and abandoned and some burned. But downtown, they kind of kept all the buildings for the most part. They knocked down some, obviously. Some of that were just beyond repair. Some that were on fire. Some that just fell apart. I mean, Michigan winters are rough. So some of them not there. But what my friend said is because they left so quickly and the city was so broke that they just left the buildings. They just left them there as they were, like Michigan Central, that giant building that they kept showing during the Detroit Lions playoff run where it was all lit up in blue, that big, tall, beautiful building. That used to be their train station. I believe it opened up in 1913. They just reopened that this year, not as a train station, but Ford opened it as an innovation lab, which I think is rad either way. I went there, and that's going to be one of the stories I'm going to talk about. But why am I telling you all this? All those old buildings are now bought and renovated or in the process of being renovated. And now you can see what Detroit looked like in its heyday, almost parts of it, you know, with new buildings in between, but like in the 60s and 50s, like what a city felt like in the 60s and 50s. That's what Detroit kind of looks like now, but brand new. And then with new buildings around it. This is really bizarre feeling where you can feel the old, like I've been to Detroit many times. And this was the first time that I've been to Detroit where I felt Detroit, where I felt the soul of the city. I felt the passion. Whereas times I've been there before, you kind of just felt sad and despair. You really did, because it was just so awful. And there was nothing there. There was a Lululemon on Woodward Avenue. You know what I mean? A Lulu flippin' lemon right there, along with like bougie restaurants and they're building the Hudson Hotel, and that's where GM is moving their operations into that building. A lot happening there. So I stopped this podcast today talking a lot about Detroit all of a sudden, but because Detroit, and I feel like Chicago and Detroit are very similar in the attitudes about what people say about our cities, about how people have written both cities off, and how both cities every year show people why we matter. And that's why I do this segment, this podcast. That's why I do my website, because I feel like many people have written Chicago off, especially lately with, hearing about crime and whatnot. And yes, there's crime, but there are parts of the city that are absolutely beautiful. And there are parts of the city that are absolutely beautiful and absolutely terrible neighborhoods. And that just gives you an idea that everything can come back. And hopefully this website shines a little light on all of the things that I do. And so I hope that you dig through the website. When you have a second, go back to past podcasts, subscribe to this. I promise I won't rant forever like I did on this one. I'm just a little impassioned about when I go to places that I love. I really want other people to love it too. So that's why I do this segment and this website. So storiesfromthe78.com, Tom Barnas, Chicago@gmail.com. If you got something you want to throw my way. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Happy hunting. We'll see you guys later.